let me set up some background to this. Elimelech, a Jewish man, Elimelech, was married to a Jewish woman named Naomi. And together, Elimelech and Naomi had two sons. Those sons were Mahlon and Chilion. All of them were residents in a small town called Bethlehem. Bethlehem was about 5-6 miles south of Jerusalem. Bethlehem was where 13 centuries after this, Jesus himself would be born. But there was a serious problem in Bethlehem at that time because Bethlehem was suffering from a severe drought and famine. It was very critical conditions. So the four of them, Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion, moved to Moab to escape the famine. Moab was a Gentile, non-Jewish nation filled with false religion and idolatrous practices. It was a mistake to move there, but the four of them did. Mahlon and Chilion married Moabite women, which was strictly forbidden in the Hebrew Bible. We call it the Old Testament. Jewish people call it the Hebrew Bible. Actually, they call it the Tanakh. But Mahlon and Chilion ignored the Hebrew scriptures and married Moabitess women, Orpah and Ruth. Elimelech died in Moab, and then his sons also died. That brings us to verse 5. Ruth 1, verse 5. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman, meaning Naomi, survived her two sons and her husband. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Verse 7, therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughter-in-laws with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. This is what happened. And this whole thing unfolds like an ancient Middle East soap opera, seriously. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, although we aren't told the specifics about his death. And then sometime after he died, his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. That means Naomi had been widowed, and Naomi was now also childless. Naomi's sons had married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, but Naomi's sons were now deceased, so Naomi's daughters-in-law were also widowed. But then Naomi heard that there was no more famine in Bethlehem. She heard that food was now available there, so Naomi decided to move home. That was a smart decision. So the three widows, Naomi, daughter-in-laws Orpah and Ruth, started to journey together to Bethlehem. But then all of a sudden, Naomi suggested a change in plans. She was still going on to Bethlehem, but she told Orpah and Ruth to return to Moab. Naomi did not want her daughters-in-law to come with her. Notice verse 8. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Dealt with the dead, meaning these women have been respectful and kind toward Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, who were now deceased. And these women have been kind to Naomi. I'm curious, why would Naomi have this sudden change of mind? Why wouldn't she want her daughters-in-law to join her in Bethlehem? I believe Naomi realized there would be practically no future for these Moabite women in Bethlehem. That's because a sincere, eligible Jewish man wouldn't want to be married to a Moabitess woman. Remember, that was forbidden. He wouldn't marry a Moabite unless she had first converted from paganism to Judaism. She had become a Jewish proselyte. Remember from part 1 of this series, we said that the Old Testament Mosaic law prohibited interreligious marriages, not interracial marriages. The Old Testament prohibited interreligious marriages, meaning marriages between God's covenant people and participants in other illegitimate religious systems. All of that was prohibited because paganism and historic Judaism were completely incompatible. It is true that Naomi's sons acted in blatant disobedience to that Mosaic ban on being married to non-believers. But remember, that happened in Moab. And Moab was a Gentile, false religious, sin-saturated environment. So there was more societal pressure for them to choose to do the wrong thing. And they did. Naomi's sons caved to that pressure. But in Bethlehem, it would be much more difficult to do that because the Bethlehem population was basically Jewish. And the societal peer pressure on the eligible Jewish men would be against religious intermarriage. So marriage prospects for these Moabite women would be almost non-existent in Bethlehem. In that Jewish environment, no one would want to marry them because they were Moabites. That's one of the reasons Naomi said to Orpah and Ruth, please stay in Moab. There's nothing for you in Bethlehem. Go home. Ruth even hoped both of them could find another husband in Moab. Verse 9, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. That meant that Naomi wished that each of these women would find a better situation in Moab than Naomi could find for them in Bethlehem. And she hoped they would be able to be married again. I should probably mention that the practice of levirate marriage was a custom at that time. The word levirate is derived from a Latin word that means husband's brother. Husband's brother. Levirate marriage was a type of marriage, don't miss this, a type of marriage that required the widow to marry her dead husband's brother. That was the essence of that custom. That form of marriage has been or is still practiced in some societies even now. But since Naomi's only sons had died, the practice of levirate marriage could not be enacted because there were no other brothers left to be married to. Naomi only had 2 sons. She had no other sons for these widowed women to be married to. So Naomi hoped that the women would find husbands in Moab. Verse 9 continues. So she kissed them. Naomi kissed her daughter-in-laws, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Verse 10, and they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. Verse 11, but Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that may be your husbands? Verse 12, turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, notice sons plural. Verse 13, would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So Naomi said goodbye to Orpah and Ruth and then embraced them. And the 3 women started to weep profusely. It is apparent from reading this passage that these women were blessed to have a unique closeness. Because on a normal basis, I should add, mothers-in-law aren't exactly all that popular. To prove my point, we all know about Mother's Day. We celebrate in the spring, but probably most of us don't know that there is also a Mother-in-Law Day. That special day was first observed in Amarillo, Texas in 1934. And our next Mother-in-Law Day is this October 26th. Now, I had a very kind and very supportive mother-in-law. I did. I was blessed to have her. I regret not being a better son-in-law. But overall, mothers-in-laws aren't the most popular people. One ancient Roman author named Juvenal said, domestic concord is impossible as long as the mother-in-law is alive. Then another Roman writer said, all mothers-in-law have ever hated their sons' wives. One German proverb said, the mother-in-law has forgotten she was ever a daughter-in-law. And I like this one best. A comedian once said, mixed emotions. Mixed emotions is when your mother-in-law drives off a cliff in your brand new Lexus. I guess in some cases that could be mixed emotions. Mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law sometimes have a toxic connection. But that wasn't true in this case, because Orpah and Ruth loved Naomi, and Naomi loved them in return. Naomi continued to insist that these women go back to Moab. Naomi said, I am too old to be married a second time, and even if I did have a husband, and even if I were to get pregnant tonight, and even if in another 9 months I gave birth to 2 more sons, would you want to wait around for them to get old enough for marriage? I don't think so. Verse 14, then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Get out the Kleenex again. This parting was extremely emotional. Orpah said goodbye and decided to return to Moab. But notice Ruth would not even consider returning to Moab. And it is said that instead she clung to Naomi and wouldn't let go. Underline this phrase, but Ruth clung to her, meaning Naomi. It's interesting that this word clung is translated from the same Hebrew word used in Genesis 2, verse 24. Genesis 2:24 defines marriage and reads, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined. Joined, that word joined is translated from that same Hebrew word. Joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And that Hebrew word that is translated as joined in Genesis 2:24 and is translated as clung in Ruth 1, verse 14, means to be stuck together, to be glued together, to be joined together. Don't miss this part. Because the Hebrew word used in Genesis 2:24 has a sexual connotation, because it states that man and woman are made one through the act of marriage, and that was a direct reference to the sexual union. Because of that, certain professing, quote unquote, gay theologians have pushed that same sort of sexual meaning into this statement from Ruth 1, verse 14. Meaning, according to them, Ruth and Naomi were actually lesbian partners. People, that is absolutely preposterous. That is a heretical distortion of Scripture to suggest that Ruth and Naomi were lesbians. Naomi and Ruth were not lesbians. Naomi and Ruth were just extremely close as friends and as daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. Verse 15, and she said to this, Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law, Orpah, has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. So Orpah has left. One more time, though, Naomi encouraged Ruth to return to Moab. And that wasn't a good suggestion. Because in encouraging Ruth to return to Moab, it seems on the surface as though Naomi was also encouraging Ruth to return to false religion. Notice she said, your sister-in-law, Orpah, has gone back to her people. And, notice, to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. On the surface, it seems as though Naomi was advocating that Ruth return to Moab paganism. But I don't believe that. I'm going to give Naomi the benefit of the doubt. I don't believe Naomi was encouraging a renewed interest in false religion. I believe she was testing Ruth to see how sincere, see how serious she was about going on to Bethlehem. And according to verses 16 and 17, Ruth was extremely sincere about that move. These verses we are about to read are probably the strongest statement of personal commitment from one person to another that is found in all Scripture. Notice verse 16. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Verse 17. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. This is a famous portion of Scripture. In fact, these particular verses are sometimes used as part of marriage ceremonies. And that's okay, because this text is applicable to marriage. If these statements are quoted in a marriage ceremony, then this is what a bride would pledge to the groom. There are 7 statements that Ruth made to Naomi, and a bride could repeat these statements in truthfulness to her groom. Statement 1, wherever you go, I will go. Ruth said if Naomi went to Bethlehem, then she would go to Bethlehem. Second statement, wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Ruth said she would stay wherever Naomi stayed. Statement 3, your people shall be my people. Ruth said she didn't want to be identified as a Moabite anymore, but she wanted to be an Israelite. She wanted to convert to Judaism. And that's evident in the 4th statement, your God shall be my God. Ruth confessed that she rejected the false religion and paganism of Moab and basically said she wanted to convert to Judaism and adopt the one true God. Statement 5, where you die, I will die. Ruth had no intentions of abandoning Naomi. This was a commitment on her part until death. 6th statement, there will I be buried. Notice how Ruth broke all ties to Moab. She did not even want to be buried in the same cemetery in Moab as her ancestors. And the 7th statement, the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Ruth said that if anything other than death separated them, then she hoped God would send her unfortunate consequences because she had left Naomi. Ruth was extremely serious about this matter. She meant business, and she never did break this 7-part promise she had made to Naomi. Verse 18, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Naomi decided, after these statements, to stop arguing with Ruth. It was evident that Ruth wasn't going to change her mind. Ruth wasn't going to return to Moab. So she just conceded to Ruth and said, okay, then let's go on to Bethlehem. Verse 19, now the 2 of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? 1 decade earlier, before moving to Moab, Naomi had been an extremely popular person in Bethlehem. But once she came home, after a decade of absence, almost no one recognized that she was Naomi. The people said, is that Naomi? How can that be Naomi? It doesn't look like the same Naomi we knew. That reminds me of my 30th high school reunion. It was the first and only class reunion I have ever attended, and I did that out of sheer curiosity. I got there, and I literally didn't recognize half my former classmates. I mean, guys that were athletes in high school, had massive beer bellies, and no hair, and I did have hair then, and had aged prematurely. And that was the guys. I don't even want to comment on the girls. It was sad. I had to constantly ask someone that I did recognize and knew. I said, who is that person standing over there? And who is that? And who is that? Because although I might have sat beside them in senior English literature class, I didn't recognize them. Then on our 50th anniversary, our 50th high school reunion, I couldn't attend, but I was sent a picture of all the graduates that were able to attend, probably 60 or more of them. I stared at that picture for probably 5 minutes. And I did not recognize a single person. I recognized literally no one because the changes were that dramatic. And the same thing happened to Naomi. I admit, Mother Nature and Father Time can do a job on anyone. But a 10-year time period alone is not enough time to age and disfigure Naomi to the point she was almost unrecognizable. It was more than time that had radically changed Naomi. It was the consequences of wrong choices. Elimelech had made a bad choice, a wrong choice in moving to Moab. Naomi might have agreed to that same bad choice, although it's also possible, she didn't agree to that choice, but she just submitted to what Elimelech had decided to do. But then Mahlon and Chilion also made bad marriage choices. Verse 20, but she said to them, meaning these other Bethlehemites that she met, she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dwelt very bitterly with me. The word Naomi, the name Naomi, means pleasantness. But Naomi wanted to be called Myra instead of Naomi. And Myra means bitter or bitterness. And this name change she's wanting is an indication of the interchangeable usage of names in ancient Middle East societies based on someone's changing life experiences. Naomi felt that her name no longer represented her most recent life experiences, so she wanted it changed to Mara, or bitterness. Naomi, or Myra, felt that her bitter experiences as a childless widow in pagan Moab was the result of God's reaction to what she and Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion had chosen to do. Notice 3 different times in this passage, Naomi comments on how God had reacted to what she had done. That's found in verses 13, 20, and then 21. Notice verse 21. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty, meaning Almighty God, has afflicted me. Notice on the note sheet a definition for a choice. A choice consists of the mental process of thinking through the merits of multiple options and selecting one of them for action. That's the essence of a choice. A choice consists of the mental process of thinking through the merits and advantages of multiple options and then selecting one of them for action. Life is all about choices. And there are so many choices we have. Throughout the remainder of this message, I want to pull 3 specific statements from this first chapter that together illustrate how important our choices are. Statement 1. Our choices, more than our circumstances, help determine who we are and what we do. Our choices, more than our circumstances. And this is, in a sense, a generic statement, and there could be some exception to this, but as a general rule, our choices, more than our circumstances, help determine who we are and what we do. Someone said, at an earlier age, our conditions determine our choices, but at a later age, our choices determine our condition. Ruth was a Moabitess, and she was raised to believe in false gods and some of the most pagan, evil practices imaginable. I mean, it doesn't get much worse than child sacrifice. And child sacrifice was practiced in Moab. But Ruth made a conscious and deliberate choice to join Naomi and move out of that intense pagan environment. She chose to follow Naomi to Bethlehem and fully expose herself to the one true God and Judaism. Ruth was not going to permit the pagan circumstances she was raised in to determine who she would be and what she would do. She chose to get out of that bad situation and be and do something altogether different. And we can all do the same thing. We don't have to be the victim to our circumstances. We can choose to rise above our circumstances. We don't need to pull the victim card, as so many people are doing. According to Romans 8, we are victors through Jesus Christ who loves us. But today, people sometimes blame their unfortunate circumstances on what they have become and what they did or are doing. I read about a convicted criminal who sat on death row and blamed the fact he had committed multiple murders. He blamed that act on fetal alcohol syndrome. He said that as an unborn fetus, his alcoholic mother drank to the extent it affected and altered his future behavior. So that this fetal alcohol condition, according to him, was actually responsible for his criminal acts. People, that's absurd. The reason this man murdered 2 teenagers in cold blood and then laughed about it after the police arrested him is simple. He chose to do what he did. And he became a murderer, not because of something his mother did, but because he made an evil choice. Listen carefully to this, or it'll go over your head. One of President Lincoln's favorite stories was about the man that murdered both his parents. Let me repeat that. This man murdered both his parents. And then at his sentence, as his sentence was about to be pronounced, he begged that the court be merciful and lenient toward him on the grounds that he was an orphan. Do you not get that? He murdered his parents. Okay. I don't know. Jokes don't work here. Anyway, okay. Me and Lincoln thought that was great, okay? I read about a politician who said to the judge, "It's not my fault, Your Honor. I could never have done all that stuff if the people hadn't elected me." No, it is our choices that determine who we are and what we do. There have been thousands of people who have refused to let times and misfortune and circumstances hold them back and chose instead to determine to be and to do something significant. Individuals who were raised in extremely humble, poor, and even abusive environments and had almost no education and other advantages. These people, in spite of that, succeeded. Thomas Edison, the greatest inventor in this nation's history, started out as a simple newspaper boy on trains. Mr. Andrew Carnegie, his first job paid him just $4 per month. John D. Rockefeller did some better at $6 per week. That was big money. Abraham Lincoln had less than a total of 18 months of formal education. Abraham Lincoln was self-taught, self-educated. He passed the bar exam on his own, never attending a class. Demosthenes was considered to be the greatest orator of ancient times, although he had a severe stuttering problem. At the beginning of his career, he would start to give a public address and be laughed off the rostrum. Napoleon, now considered a military genius, but he finished 46 in his military academy graduating class of 65. Beethoven was deaf. Plato was a hunchback. Actor and martial arts professional Chuck Norris, who is a professing Christian, Chuck was raised in an abusive alcoholic home. Chuck lost his first 10 competitive karate fights, and none of those bouts were even close. But Norris never lost another fight after that one. He ultimately won a total of 180 tournament fights. These men did not let circumstances determine who they were and what they did. Some time ago in a previous congregation, I was in a terrible, sour mood. I just had a bad attitude. I was griping about something I was obligated to do. I didn't want to do it, but I didn't have a choice. So I was complaining. And someone in the office, another staff member, got tired of hearing about that moaning and groaning and frustration and told me I had 2 basic choices. I could choose to do that something with a good attitude, or I could choose to do that something with a not so good attitude. This person said a good attitude could actually make me feel better, and a bad attitude could make the people around me want to avoid me. But the choice would be mine. That's the reason someone said, even if life hands you a lemon, you can still make lemonade. Second statement, our choices affect people other than ourselves. Our choices affect people other than ourselves, and that effect could be good, and that effect could also not be so good. In this particular case, Naomi's choice to return to Bethlehem had an immediate positive effect on Ruth, and another effect on the genealogical messianic line, and another indirect effect on each person in this room, because in a literal sense, our salvation was made possible because Naomi made the choice to return to Bethlehem. The reason that's true, and we will expand on this as we continue, the reason that is true is because toward the end of this book, Ruth married a gentleman named Boaz, and then gave birth to a son she named Obed. Obed became the grandfather to King David. And then Jesus, who is the Jewish Messiah, as prophesied, was born a direct descendant from David. So the bigger picture is that Naomi's decision to return to Bethlehem has, in a positive sense, affected the entire human race through the ultimate subsequent birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The point is that what we do affects other people. John Donne was a 17th century English poet, preacher. Actually, he was an Anglican priest and an attorney. He's probably best known as a poet. And one of his most famous works was called No Man is an Island. Listen to this. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. A church bell would be rung in a village or town each time someone had died. So John Donne said, never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That means we are all in this humanity thing together. John Maxwell, he is a evangelical guru on leadership. He said that sociologists estimate, and I don't know how they come up with these numbers, sociologists estimate that even the most introverted person, the ultimate introverted person, still touches or influences 10,000 other people during his lifetime. And that's an introvert. So who knows the number of people an extrovert touches? The point is, we are not alone. And sometimes in our self-centeredness, sometimes in our selfishness, we forget the fact our choices affect people other than ourselves. I used to teach that suicide was the most selfish act imaginable. I've stated that, I'm certain, dozens of times. I have since learned that is a controversial statement. On the surface, suicide does seem extremely selfish, but someone who commits suicide doesn't see it like that. He has a distorted perspective on his situation. I don't pretend to understand the psychological dysfunction of someone who commits suicide. It's complicated. But most often, the potential suicide victim feels he is a burden to others. And he rationalizes that if he deleted himself through suicide, then others would be relieved. He has this twisted idea that people would be better off if he weren't here. So this suicidal person actually considers suicide to be a selfless act and not a selfish one. But what is not controversial is that each suicide victim leaves behind relatives, friends, and other associations that had an intimate connection to the person that committed suicide. A parent and or parents, a marriage partner, a significant other, a sibling and or siblings, and even a child or children of the suicide victim. 80% of all suicides are committed at home. And the remains after a suicide, especially the remains after a fatal gunshot, the remains are cleaned up by a close friend or relative. And this is a shocking statistic. But of those people that clean up the suicide remains, 75% of them are now more likely to commit suicide themselves. The point is that someone's choices affect people other than themselves. Statement 3. Our choices and God's sovereign plan together determine what happens to us. Things happened to Ruth in Bethlehem that would not have happened if she had chosen to remain in Moab. In Bethlehem, she had the chance to have a relationship to the one true God. In Bethlehem, she had the chance to be remarried, and this time married to a much better man. In Bethlehem, she had the chance to be a part of the genealogical messianic line, and that was an incredible privilege. The different things that happened in Bethlehem were all part of God's overall sovereign plan, meaning God predetermined that all that was absolutely going to happen. But at the same time, Ruth had the free choice to go to Bethlehem or to remain in Moab. That's called a paradox. A paradox consists of two statements that are each true, but those statements are irreconcilable. Those statements on the surface seem to contradict one another. It is extremely important to understand that all our choices are subject to God's sovereign control. To be sovereign means to be in charge. God is sovereign, meaning God is in charge. To say that God is sovereign means that he is in total and absolute control of all that happens. For those wannabe theologians in the room, the fact God is sovereign doesn't mean hard determinism or meticulous determinism. And probably most of you have not heard those words and are curious, what is hard determinism? What is meticulous determinism? I suggest you see Spence after the service because he'll be thrilled to explain that to you, I'm sure. Right? Yeah. So remember, all that happens to us is because the sovereign God, in a direct sense, has caused it to happen, or in an indirect sense, he has permitted it to happen. I should add, hard determinism only believes the first half of that statement, not the second half. God, in his sovereignty, causes things to happen in a direct sense. And sometimes God, still in his sovereignty, in an indirect sense, permitted something to happen. But the interesting thing is that in spite of the fact God is sovereign and is in absolute control, God gives us free choices. And on the surface, that sounds completely illogical. But in a mysterious sense, that combination of God's sovereign plan and our free choices together determine what happens to us. That's basically impossible for us to understand as finite human beings. But let me attempt to illustrate that. Now, Mike Rizzo, who's walking down the aisle, and Faith came back from a Caribbean cruise on Carnival Cruise Lines, right? So good for you. But I'm going to use a little different illustration. Suppose we board a Princess cruise ship from the port at Seattle, Washington, and we have done that. And the Princess Cruise Lines, which are headquartered in Valencia, California, in the Santa Clarita Valley, the Princess Cruise Lines has scheduled that particular ship we're on to sail to Alaska. Once we're aboard that ship, we are going to Alaska, whether we want to or not. There's nothing we can do about it because Princess Cruise Lines has sovereignly determined that ship is going to end up in Alaska. So we're stuck. But on board that ship, we have choices. We have probably dozens of choices. We can choose to go on a casual walk around the deck, or we can choose to go to the gym, or go to the spa, or catch a movie, or show, or take a nap in our room, or just sit on the deck in a chair and read. But even though we can choose to do what we want to do, we are still subject to the overall predetermined, pre-scheduled plan that Princess Cruise Lines has established, and that is to bring us to Alaska. Some of the choices we can make aboard that ship are good choices that will result in something beneficial to us, especially something that might result in a form of relaxation. But then some choices might not be so good choices that affect the negative result. One example of that, and I was guilty of this, one example of that is that the food on the Princess Cruise Line is basically incredible. There is so much quality, so much quantity, and variation, and it's available just about any time someone wants it. So if someone chooses to overindulge in eating from that ship's cuisine, then that choice can have negative consequences because that person has then subjected himself to some unwanted pounds and inches. People said, would you ever go on a cruise again? I said, no. I can't control myself around that much food. I can't do it. But good choices or bad choices, each passenger is still going to end up in Alaska because that was the sovereign, predetermined, predestined, pre-scheduled decision of the Princess Cruise Lines. Now listen carefully as I transition from that analogy to the essence of Romans 8:28 and 29. Verse 28, and we know that all things work together for good. Notice, not that all things are good. Some things are not good, but all things work together for good to those who love God. That should be us. And to those who are the called according to his purpose. And what is God's ultimate purpose for each Christian? Excellent question. And verse 29 answers that question. For whom he, God, foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And God's Son is Jesus. God has made a predetermined, pre-scheduled, sovereign decision that each Christian is ultimately going to conform in total to his Son, Jesus Christ. And that means as Christians, we are predetermined to, in a progressive, experiential, daily sense, resemble Jesus more and more and more during this lifetime until we see Jesus in person at his return, and then we are going to be made completely like him. Minus the scars from the crucifixion, he alone will have those scars, we won't. But other than that, we will be like Jesus. And that total transformation is considered to be the ultimate cruise line destination. But throughout that lifelong process of conforming us more and more to resemble Jesus, we have free choices. Some choices are good choices and result in good things. And some choices are bad choices and result in not so good things. Not so good things such as missed opportunities, sexually transmitted diseases, unnecessary injuries, limited income potential, a troubled marriage, and on and on and on and on. But those choices, both good and bad choices, aren't going to change the sovereign, predestined, predetermined, pre-scheduled destination, and that is that we would ultimately be conformed to completely resemble Jesus. What we need to remember is that God can still use the good, the bad, and even the ugly as part of his sovereign, predetermined agenda to bring us closer to that ultimate destination of being conformed completely to his Son, Jesus Christ. It might not make sense to us at the moment, but it makes perfect sense to God because he is sovereign. He is in charge. He has either caused something to happen or else he has permitted something to happen so that it can fit into his predetermined plan to conform us to Jesus. I read something recently. There's a perfect comment on our choices. Portia Nelson was a singer, actress, author, and poet. She was best known for her role in the film Sound of Music. She also authored an influential book called There's a Hole in My Sidewalk. Listen to this. Chapter 1. She said, I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. But it isn't my fault. But it takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. So I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there, but I still fall in. It's a habit now. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk, so I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. Doesn't that describe human choices? I think it does. Let's stand to our feet. We're going to be dismissed in just a few minutes. And hope you probably need to get out there. We're going to meet with those members of the name nominating committee, and we'll have lunch, and then we will determine a name, another name, a denominationally neutral name for our church. And that will happen this afternoon. So you pray for wisdom, guys. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for this wonderful day. I know it's a little chilly out there, but the sun is shining, and that makes everything all good. So glad that we could be in your house today. So glad that I could be here with other members of your great big family. I'm so grateful that you are doing what you're doing in our church. I thank you for David Tyson, who has expended himself on our behalf to create a design that will be attractive and practical and efficient use for our worship of God. I pray for him and continued wisdom in the meeting Tuesday night. And I thank you so much for what else you're doing. Next Sunday, I hope to announce that we are going to be recipients of some significant financial support that will help us in our task of constructing a building. So, Father, thank you for your goodness. Give us much wisdom in the meeting after this. And I pray that the name that is selected will be one that all of us can get behind and be proud of, and we can move forward. So I commit this to you, and again, thank you for your goodness. In Jesus' name, amen.